There's this incredible irony about Hanukkah, which is that it's probably the most well-known Jewish holiday. Like, the whole world is familiar with Hanukkah. You know, there's menorahs everywhere, public lightings, and so on. And yet, it's actually in our text, it's the least spoken of, pretty much, of any holiday. You know, it's not in the Tanakh, although there is a book of Maccabees, but it's not in the Tanakh. It's a later book. There's no tractate in Mishnah or Talmud about it. It's just kind of spoken of in Masechet Shabbat, but it doesn't get its own attention. And even in Kabbalistic texts, at least in the early Kabbalistic texts, it's hardly even really mentioned. And yet, the irony is that it's probably the most deeply mystical holiday that we have, as we will see, hopefully, today. We mentioned recently, very briefly, that Hanukkah is associated with the divine light of creation, the light of creation. The first thing that God created in the Torah, day one, Vayehi O, let there be light. And Hanukkah is associated with that initial primordial light. So a quick recap, if you remember, we said how on day one, God created light. And then on day 4, the Torah says God created me'orot, luminaries, physical lights, the sun, the stars, things that give light. So the classic question is, what's the difference between the light of the first day and then the lights of the 4th day, the luminaries? Because the 4th day makes sense. These are things that give off light, these physical objects that give off light. So what was the light of the first day? Where did that light come from? And of course, our sages say that was really the light of creation. The Zohar says that really the name of the book of the Zohar, which is very, very famous, talks about Zohar means radiance. It means light. It talks about we talked about this before, that the initial light of creation, that God used that light to make all matter, to form all matter from that initial primordial light. Everything was made of light. And that light, the Midrash says, that initial light shone for 3 days, for the first 3 days, because then on the 4th day, you had the creation of physical lights, and so that initial light was kind of hidden. And so it's referred to as the hidden light, the Or HaGanuz, the hidden light of creation. So if it shone for 3 days before there was like physical light, physical light-giving objects, and the Torah says that each day had 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark, so 12 hours times 3 days is 36 hours. So the Midrash says that this light originally shone for 36 hours before it was kind of concealed by the physical light. So it was 36 hours. And then, when Adam was created, God gave Adam this light as a gift. And our sages say that with that light, Adam was able to see from one end of the universe to the other. He could see all of history. He could even perhaps traverse the cosmos. There was something special about this light. It had incredible power, and Adam was able to use it. But after he sinned, he lost that light. So how long did Adam have it for? Another Midrash says that he was made on Friday, and then there was 12 hours of day, and then there was Shabbat, 24 hours, and at the end of Shabbat, God took it away. So Adam had it for 12 hours of Friday, 24 hours of Shabbat, 36 hours. So it shone originally for 36 hours, then it was concealed by physical light, then God gave this light as a gift to Adam. Adam lost that divine light, and God took it away, and the Midrash says God hid it under his throne, under his sapphire throne, whatever that means, and he hid it, he concealed it for the tzaddikim in the world to come. That in the world to come, God will re-gift this divine light to all the tzaddikim. So we explored that before. So now this light is associated with the number 36. It's actually associated with 4 major numbers, and the first of them is the number 36, because this light shone for 36 hours, because Adam had use of it for 36 hours, so this divine light is associated with the number 36. And Hanukkah is really a celebration of that specific divine light. And that's why if you count how many actual lights do we kindle on Hanukkah, 1 on the first day, 2, plus 3, plus 4, plus 5, altogether, right, 8 days, altogether 36 lights. And that's supposed to allude to this divine light of creation, which shone for 36 hours. So Hanukkah is really all about that divine mystical light, not about physical light, and we have to explore that. What does that mean? What is the difference between a spiritual light, or this divine primordial light, and the physical light? That's what we have to really explore today. And Hanukkah is about the spiritual light, which is actually why on a mystical level, you might know that we have an halacha that you're not allowed to use the lights of Hanukkah for a physical purpose. You cannot read a book by the candlelight of of the Hanukkah flames. So you're not allowed to use them for physical purposes. That's why we add a shamash. You add an additional candle, that ninth candle or a ninth light, to serve as kind of like a physical light so that you don't inadvertently, accidentally use the light for a physical purpose. And the reason behind that on a mystical level is because you shouldn't think that the Hanukkah lights are physical lights. They are symbolizing something much deeper. And that's what we want to explore today. And again, the discussion of this in the mystical texts it's very hard to find. This is basically, we're going to try to uncover one of the greatest secrets really in all of Torah. So, we have this idea of 36. The Hanukkah lights, there's 36 lights. In fact, the month is Kislev. Hanukkah is in the month of Kislev. And Kislev, if you split the word, is Kis, Kaf, Samech, and Lev, Lamed Vav. Lamed Vav is 36. And Kis means to cover up. Lechasot is to cover up. And Kislev is that's what it means. It means that it's the hidden light. It's the covered light. That's what we're trying to reveal. So even the month of Kislev alludes to this number 36. And the other number, there's three other numbers that this divine light is associated with. The next one is the number 25. 25 is also, again, these are patterns. So when you see the number 36, it somehow hints to the divine light. We saw that recently when we spoke about the 36 hidden tzaddikim, right? Like in every generation, there's a 36 perfect tzaddikim, kind of like hidden tzaddikim in the world. That's also associated with this number. So wherever you see Lamed Vav, whenever you see 36, it somehow alludes to the divine light. Another number that alludes to it is 25. And that originally comes from the fact that in creation, when God says, let there be light, Vayehi Or, the word light, Or, is the 25th word of the Torah. So it appears in place number 25, and it becomes associated with the number 25. And so you often see this number 25, Kaf Hey, is associated with the divine light. Hanukkah itself is Hanu, Kaf Hey, Hanukkah. It starts on the 25th of Kislev. Now, why is Hanukkah specifically? We saw how the word Kislev, the month name, alludes to the divine light, and also the day. It's the 25th of Kislev, because 25 is Kaf Hey. And Chanukah, literally, if you split it, it's like they dedicated on the 25th. Right? So it's associated with that. Really what it means is they brought back the light, the divine light, on the 25th, on that day. So 25 is associated with the divine light. In fact, when Adam lost that divine light, what did God tell him? What is the first word that God told Adam when he lost that light, when he sinned? God said, Ayeka. What does that mean, Ayeka? So it's translated as, where are you? Which is like, yeah, that's what he said on a pshat level, on a very simple level. It's like, where are you? But obviously God knew where he was. That wasn't really the question. The question was, if you split it, Ayeka literally is Ayeh, which is where, and Ka is Kafhe. So what God was really saying is, Ayeka, where is the light? Right? You lost your divine light. I gifted you this wonderful, this amazing light, and you lost it. So what he was really saying, Ayeka, is where is the light? And the same thing happened when the temple was destroyed. When the temple was destroyed, the prophet Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, he wrote a book that we read on Tisha B'Av every year, right? Megillat Eicha. That's how it began. Eicha, it's called in English Lamentations, where Jeremiah was mourning the destruction of the temple. And there's this mysterious word, Eicha. What does that mean, Eicha? It's actually the same word as Ayeka. It's spelled the same way. It's Aleph Yud Kaf Hey. It's Ayeh Kaf Hey. Where is the light? That's what he's really saying, because the temple was that place in the world that brought forth that divine light, and the temple was destroyed. So what Jeremiah was really saying is, where is the light? Right? The light is gone. The light of the world, the divine light is missing. And that's what Eicha means. So we read it and we don't really realize, how do you translate that word, Eicha? What does that mean? So Ayeka and Eicha, really, they're all referring to Kaf Hey, the divine light that was lost. Even the word Kohen, to be a priest, what does it mean, Kohen? It seems like, it's like, what is the root of that word? It's really Kaf Hey. Kohen is like the person that's supposed to bring out, that the role of the priest was to try to bring out some of that divine light into the world. And so you see this root, this like Kaf Hey, this 25 association in many places. So we had 36 and we have 25. And then the other two numbers that allude to the divine light is the number 8, and that's where we come to Hanukkah, the number 8, and the number 378. And to that we need to go to the Arizal. So the Arizal says that the 8 days of Hanukkah, Really, they correspond to the 8 sfirot. Remember, we had 10 sfirot. And the 8 sfirot, starting with Bina, the third one, from Bina down to the last one, which is Malchut. So Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yisod, Malchut. Those 8 sfirot from Bina down to Malchut, which have to do with something really important in creation, which we'll get to. But the 8 days of Hanukkah correspond directly to the 8 sfirot from Bina to Malchut. Okay? That's what the Arizal is saying. Now, if you remember the Zohar, it often calls the sfirot, it doesn't call them sfirot, it calls them tikkunim. Right? We read it in the Sidur in Patach Eliyahu. If you remember Patach Eliyahu, what do we say in Patach Eliyahu? That God created Antu Da'apakt Asar Tikkunin, that God created 10 tikkunin and called them the Karinan Lon Eser Sfiran, and they're called the 10 sfirot. But he made 10 tikkunin. So the question is, what is a tikkun? What does the word tikkun actually mean? We know, like in Hebrew, it means letaken, is to fix something, but the Aramaic word tikkun literally means a garment. It's something that you wear, is a tikkun. Actually, that root appears in other languages too, actually. Like in Russian as well. In Russian, that same 3-letter root, tkain. A tkain is a garment. It's something that, it's a fabric, let's say, is tkain. So the word tikkun in Aramaic, actually, in other languages as well, you see that root. But in Aramaic, tikkun literally means a garment. And in Hebrew, the garment, how would you say garment in Hebrew? If you were to translate, so in Aramaic, tikkun is a garment. How do you say a garment in Hebrew, in the original? Beged is one way. Beged is like clothing. And in the original biblical language, and this is what the Arizal says, is that it's a semel, like simla. Simla is like in modern Hebrew, like a dress. So semel is like a garment, something that you wear. And the Arizal says that you basically have these 8 garments, right? These 8 sfirot from Bina to Malchut are like 8 garments. And so in Hebrew it would be chet, 8 is chet. Chet semel. Chet semel represents these 8 garments. These are 8 garments, chet semel. And the numerical value of this word, actually it's the same as the value for another word for a garment in Hebrew is malbush. So the Arizal says malbush, what's the gematria? What's the numerical value of malbush? Mem, lamed, 40, 30. Bet is 2, vav is 6, shin is 300. Malbush is 378. So the value of malbush is 378, and that alludes to the fact that these garments are really composed of 378 lights. So the 8 lights, these 8 garments, these 8 days, these 8 representing these 8 garments, they are composed of 378 inner lights. And that's represented by the word chet semel. And what is chet semel? What is the Arizal, what is he actually referring to? Chet semel, put it together, that word, chet, shin, mem, lamed, chashmal. Chashmal. And the numerical value of Chashmal, again, Chet is 8, Shin is 300, Mem is 40, Lamed is 30, Chashmal is 378. So, Chashmal represents this divine light of creation that actually has 378 components to it. It has 378 inner lights. So what we want to really explore is, what is Chashmal? Chashmal is the most mysterious word in the whole Tanakh, in all of Jewish literature. The most mysterious word is Chashmal. Yeah, it's in the Tanakh. It appears in one place, in 2 places, in one chapter, in chapter 1, in Yechezkel, in Ezekiel, in the Tanakh. The reason you don't remember it is because when do we read Ezekiel? We read it, this chapter, it's the Haftarah of Shavuot. So what happens on Shavuot? People stay up all night. And then they start praying like at 5 a.m, and everybody's sleeping. By the time you get to the Haftarah, nobody remembers what they read. And then they go to sleep, and that's the end of it. And the sages did that kind of deliberately, because some of them said that we should never read the first chapter of Ezekiel because it's so mind-blowing, and it's so deeply mystical and cryptic. That's right. It's the Maaseh Merkava. It's when Ezekiel saw the divine chariot. He saw angels coming from heaven in what appeared to him as a chariot. And he describes this chariot in detail, and it's an amazing description. So some of our sages said we should never read that at all, because it's just too mystical. And the Talmud says in Masechet Chagiga, this is Maaseh Merkava, right? Remember before we said how Kabbalah, really traditional Kabbalah, the original Kabbalah, had 2 aspects. There was Maaseh Bereshit, which is understanding the account of creation. So we're focusing on the first chapter of Bereshit, of Genesis. all the secrets encoded there. And the other half of Kabbalah is Maaseh Merkava, the secret of the divine chariot, which is this vehicle of prophecy. The prophet saw this chariot, and it wasn't just Ezekiel. Ishayahu saw it and described it a little bit, and Daniel saw it, and who else? And Eliyahu saw it, right? Eliyahu was taken up to heaven in this flaming, as well, chariot. So many of our prophets, or perhaps even all of them, witnessed the divine chariot. When the Jewish people witnessed, at the Exodus witnessed the divine chariot. So it's a vehicle of prophecy, just that Ezekiel described it most closely in the closest language and in very great detail. And in Masechet Chagiga, which is also the most mystical, probably, tractate of the whole Talmud, it asks, Ad Eichan Ma'aseh Merkava, where, until when is the actual Ma'aseh Merkava? Where is that deeply mystical chapter? And Rebbe Omer Ad Va'era, until that verse, the second verse that begins Va'era, and Rabbi Yitzchak Omer Ad Chashmal, until the word Chashmal in chapter 1, that's where Ma'aseh Merkava ends. And then the Gemara goes on to say something really famous. And he says, which Chashmal are you talking? What is this mysterious Chashmal? And it says, Ve'ha hahu Chanukah didrash bechashmal. And it reminds you, do you remember that Chanukah? The Chanukah means the child, the youth. There was a child who grasped Chashmal. And what happened to him? Unafka nura ve'achaltea. And a flame seemingly came down from heaven and consumed him. That this youth was able to grasp the word Chashmal, and it was so mystical that his soul left his body. It was such a deep, great secret. And our sages say, Shani Chanukah, because he was different because he was too young. And they say, the lav mate zimnei, that his time had not yet come to learn these things. He was too young to learn this. And so his soul just couldn't handle it, and his soul left his body. But Chashmal was such an intensely powerful term, and our sages almost trembled at its mention. So what is this Chashmal? What does it mean? What does the word Chashmal mean? In modern Hebrew, what does it mean? Electricity. In modern Hebrew, it means electricity. So we have, how did they get that? How did the modern Hebrew, the architects of modern Hebrew, get to Chashmal? And when you hear that, usually, like in the Jewish world, we say that Chashmal cannot be electricity. It must be referring to something deeply spiritual, mystical. It can't just be the electricity that we all use daily. And that must be that, like, the people who came up with modern Hebrew kind of misused that word, took that word from Ezekiel and used it in a non-kosher way. But that's actually completely inaccurate, because the people who said that Chashmal is electricity is not the architects of modern Hebrew. It's our own sages. Chazal said that Chashmal is electricity.
But in the old days when electricity didn't exist, you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So let's see. Let's define, let's explore this. Yeah. So you have this incredible, mysterious term, Chashmal, which our sages said, really, ideally, we should bury it, because the average person shouldn't even try to understand it. It's so deep. So what does Ezekiel say? I'm just going to quote a few of the... You really need to read the whole chapter. And Ezekiel says, so he saw that there was a great wind that came from the north, anan gadol, a great cloud, and there was fire from the cloud, right? And v'nogalo saviv, and it was all glowing all around, and from it was something that looked like chashmal, mitocha esh, from that fire. So he's seeing this great cloud coming from the sky, fire coming out of it. It was glowing, and there's Chashmal in this. That's what he's saying. He's seeing Chashmal intermixed with this fire and cloud. And then he's seeing these creatures, udmuta chayot mareim kegachalei esh, these kind of glowing creatures that they're like glowing coals of fire. Ba'arot kamarei lepidim, they have torches of flames coming out of them seemingly. Hi mitalechet ben achayot venoga le'esh, and so there's again all this glow and fire. Umin ha'esh yotze barak. So he's saying that from this fire, he's describing it, and he's trying to make sense of what he's seeing, Ezekiel, over 2,500 years ago, and he's saying, so there's this lightning coming out of the flame. So Yechezkel is already making a connection here between Chashmal and lightning. And today, of course, we know that lightning is very much electricity. Lightning is Chashmal. The famous Benjamin Franklin experiment of flying a kite in the rainstorm, which probably never happened, right? You know this legend of Ben Franklin going out in the rainstorm. Anyway, whatever. But so today we know that lightning is, of course, electricity. And this is where we really have to see what did he mean by Chashmal. You remember the Septuagint that of Ptolemy? You remember the story of the 72 rabbis? You remember this? No? Okay. So about, let's say, 22-ish hundred years ago, before the Hanukkah story, actually, remember that it's important to actually note this. When we talk about Hanukkah, we often hear that Hanukkah is Jews fighting Greeks. It's not quite like that. I mean, that's a very general statement, because the truth is that the Greeks were not one uniform people. And Hanukkah is really, the Jews were fighting the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucids. They weren't fighting the Egyptian Greeks, the Ptolemaic Greeks. Because, in fact, the Egyptian Greeks actually helped the Maccabees. They probably helped to arm the Maccabees against the Syrian Greeks. Because Israel, Judea, was ruled by the Egyptian Greeks, and then the Egyptian Greeks lost it to the Syrian Greeks because they were fighting each other. And originally that happened in the time of, I believe, Antiochus III, who was actually originally nice to the Jews. And then his son, Antiochus IV, was the one that started the persecutions. So when Judea was still under Egyptian Greek rule, which was the Ptolemaic dynasty, this is what happened. One of the Ptolemies, there was a whole bunch of them, who ruled over Egypt, and they were Greek. So another thing is, the Spartans, the famous Spartans in mainland Greece, also supported the Maccabees, right? If you read the book of Maccabees and some of the historical sources that we have, the king of Sparta sent a letter to the Maccabees of support. Right? So actually, the Maccabees had support from other Greeks. It wasn't like Jews fighting all Greeks. It was Jews fighting Syrian Greeks. And the Maccabees actually did have support from other Greeks, like the Spartans and the Egyptian Greeks. So that's important, a historical detail that's actually important to point out. So one of the Egyptian Greek kings before the Hanukkah events, he wanted, if you remember in Alexandria in Egypt, there used to be what's called as the Great Library. The idea was to collect all the world's texts and to be like the center of scholarship for the whole world. It no longer exists. It was destroyed a long time ago. But Alexandria used to have this great wonder of the world, which was the Great Library. And so Ptolemy, he wanted to make sure that he had every book in the world in his library. And he's missing the Torah, right? The Tanakh. And the Jews didn't want to translate the Tanakh. It's a holy text. We didn't want to corrupt it into another language. So he gathered 72 rabbis and forced them into 72 different rooms and made them translate it. And he separated them because he wanted to make sure that they're not going to lie and that they're all going to do it accurately. And of course, a miracle happened in that they all translated it in the exact same way. And they did make slight variations in roughly a dozen places. And they all miraculously did it the same way. So the rabbis translated the Torah, the Tanakh, into Greek. So now if we look at the Septuagint and we see how did Chazal translate these 72 great rabbis, how did they translate the Tanakh into Greek? How did they translate the word Chashmal? What word did they use for the word Chashmal? And I'm not going to try to read I looked up the Septuagint, the whole verse in Greek. I'm not going to read it in Greek because I'm going to butcher it. But the word Chashmal, guess what they called it?
Come on.
They translated as electron. That's how our sages, 2,200 years ago, translated in the Septuagint the word Chashmal. They translated it as electron.
220 years ago.
2,200 years ago. Roughly 2,200 years ago.
Nobody knew what 2,000 years ago was.
So let's see. Did they know what electron? Where did they get this word? So the Greek electros, it really is the word for amber. Amber, the stone, like this hardened kind of tree sap, amber. So the ancient Greek philosophers, they noticed something, that when you rub amber with like a cloth, it builds up a lot of static, and you can like shock your friend with it or whatever. So when you rub amber, it builds up static, right? Just like you rub like your socks, you have like wool socks, you rub them against the carpet, you touch a doorknob, you get a little shock. So you could generate a lot of static from rubbing amber. And amber is electros. the word. So the word electricity actually comes from the Greek word for amber because the ancient Greeks knew to generate static electricity from it. And it's been pointed out, by the way, that the Hebrew word, some say that the Hebrew word for amber is leshem. There's a stone also mentioned in Tanakh called leshem, and some people say that leshem is the Hebrew word for, they identified the stone leshem with amber, and of course leshem shares the same letters as Hashmal, has 3 of the same letters. You can read it as chet leshem. So perhaps there is an amber connection there. Now, our sages translated Chashmal as electron. There is a connection there with the Greek idea of electricity, of rubbing amber to generate static. Who was it in modern times, in modern Hebrew, that put into the modern Hebrew dictionary that electricity is Chashmal? Yeah, it was in the 1800s. It was a man named Yehuda Leib Gordon. Yehuda Leib Gordon. Now, Yehuda Leib Gordon was a huge Talmid Chacham. He was a child prodigy. By the time he was a teenager, he knew all of Shas by heart. He knew the whole Talmud by heart, the whole Tanakh by heart. He was an absolute genius.
The only problem is that he got caught up with the Haskalah movement and he became a poet, and that's why you've never heard of him. Although he did later become disenchanted with Haskalah.
He was basically, he's not really known in the religious world.
He invented the Hebrew language.
No, he didn't invent the whole, he coined the term Chashmal. So for modern Hebrew, there was many people, like Ben Yehuda is more famous, right? Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda is the more famous one, but many other scholars coined various words. So Yehuda Leib Gordon is the one who coined the word electricity for Chashmal. And again, he was a huge Talmid Chacham, and he did it really based on Chazal. Chazal translated Chashmal in the Septuagint as electricity, right, as electron. And so when people say that Chashmal must be something spiritual, they are inaccurate in when they say that, because actually the Arizal says the exact opposite. The Arizal knew this secret better than anybody. If you read the Arizal, you can see the Kitvei HaRizal that were written by his student Chaim Vital. You can see that the Arizal really grasped electricity, and he was way ahead of his time because he lived in the 1500s. And all these things, electricity did not really become a thing until started really in the 1700s, and then only in the 1800s that we really started to understand it. So the Arizal was way ahead of his time, as we'll see. And the Arizal is saying in Sharei Kedusha, listen to what he's saying. So like the meaning of the Yechezkel's vision, Ezekiel's vision, Hanikra Ma'aseh Merkava, which is called the Ma'aseh Merkava, the divine chariot. Vezeu Sod HaNe'elam, this is the great secret, the concealed secret, Sheyesh Be'inyan HaChashmal, that is in this concept of Chashmal, Ki hu begimatria malbush. As we said, this is the gimatria of malbush, this garment, the spiritual garment. And look what he says, Vehu hakli ve'achomer. This is the tool and the substance. Chomer is a physical substance, right? Chomer is something physical, not ruchani. It's something chomer. It's something very physical. Shel orot amalachim, of that light of the angels. And he actually goes on, Rabbi Chaim Vital, when he writes this, he says, "V'Hashem yichaper be'adi begaloti sod nehelam hazeh." He says, "May God forgive me for revealing this great secret." And we'll see a little bit more about what he's saying. He's saying that this Chashmal is really the substance of the light of these angels. It's their power source. It's their tool and the substance that they use to do what they do. The Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, he was the leader of the Kabbalists of Sfat before the Arizal. So he preceded the Arizal. And there, in the 1500s. 1500s. Yeah. Same time. Yeah, he passed away right before. Like the story goes that the Arizal really came to Tzfat when the Ramak passed away and took over the circle of Kabbalists in Tzfat. And so the Ramak wrote another really important textbook of Kabbalah called Pardes Rimonim. He kind of was really the first to systematize all of Kabbalah into one clear. And he repeats that he's saying, Chashmal shehu chomer anoset tzurot. It's like a substance that's really carrying all these forms, these creatures, these creations. And this is really, he's saying, I'm just kind of skimming through it. But what's that? Oh yeah. Could very well. I mean, think of what Yechezkel is seeing. He's seeing a thing flying from the sky, right?
Yeah.
A person who doesn't know this will say, "Oh, that's a UFO. That's that must be an alien." No, it's just angels, right? He's describing angels, and he says, "V'zeu vayar Elokim kitov." Right? This is the secret of that God saw the light, that it was good, right? The original light, and he actually connects it to lighting the candles, because then he says. And he says that connects to the pasuk in the Torah where it says that Aaron, the high priest, would light the menorah. When he would light the candles, the menorah.
So what does it have to do with holograms? Can it be adjusted or
Holograms?
holograms?
And why do you bring up holograms?
Electricity, lights, figures.
Let's see. Let's get to the bottom of this. We're starting to get somewhere, right, with this Chashmal. We're starting to get. Let's see what this really means. So the Ramak said what we just said. The Ramak said that this is what the Chashmal is, and the Ramak connects it directly to the light of creation. Okay? And actually, the Ramak says clearly in another place that this is the Or HaGanuz. He calls it the Or HaNignaz, that original divine light that was concealed. He also gives another gematria, that Or Pniel, that the light of the face of God. Pniel is really an angel, but it's also literally means as if Pnei El, the light of the face of God. We just saw it in last week's parsha, right? Yaakov wrestled the angel, and he says that like seeing the angel is like seeing the face of God. And so the light of the angel, Or Pniel, is also Keminyan Chashmal. It's also the gematria of Chashmal. So the light of these angels, the power of these angels, comes from Chashmal. Now we have to make sense of all this. What does Chashmal have to do with, first of all, with light? Because we're calling it seemingly a hidden light, right? Electricity, light, what's the connection? What does it have to do with creation? And what does this have to do with Hanukkah? We have to put all this together. And so we're saying the 8 days of Hanukkah correspond to these 8 garments, these 8 sfirot, which have 378 lights, which correspond to this Chashmal idea, that they are the Chashmal. Okay, what does that really mean? So we have to understand what electricity is, scientifically. What is electricity? Yeah, it's electrons doing something, right? So we think of it on a simple level as a flow of electrons. It's really the energy that's carried between the electrons. The electrons themselves, the electrons are moving. So we have to really understand the electron, because Chazal said electron, remember? J.J. Thomson discovered the electron in the late 1800s. I don't know if he knew this, but I don't think he knew that J.J. Thomson, that Chazal used that word electron in translating Chashmal. J.J. Thomson discovered the electron because he passed electricity through a cathode ray tube, and he was able to do a mass charge ratio. He was able to calculate that that whatever is in this electricity must be 2,000 times smaller, just about 2,000 times smaller than a hydrogen atom. And hydrogen was the smallest known atom. Hydrogen is the smallest, 1 proton only. It's atomic. It's number 1. If you remember your periodic table, on the periodic table, hydrogen's number 1. And so J.J. Thomson realized that there's something 2,000 times smaller than the smallest known atom, which was revolutionary. It was an incredible discovery that totally transformed all of science. Because remember, the atomic theory was that atoms are indivisible. And now J.J. Thomson discovered something even smaller than an atom. And with time, we realize what electrons really are. And they're flying around the nucleus and really giving structure, giving matter. It's bringing matter to life, right? The nucleus is the center of the atom is the nucleus with its protons and neutrons, and they don't really do much. They're just there. But it's the electrons that are kind of whizzing around in this cloud, whatever that is, around the atoms that gives the atom its real substance. So the electrons actually give rise to matter. And electrons interact with light all the time. Photons, when something glows, what's really happening, if you look at a neon lamp, what's going on? You pass electricity through it. What's happening is that the electrons are getting excited, they're absorbing energy, they jump to a higher energy level, and then they fall back to their ground state, and they release photons, they release light. there's this incredible interaction, constant interaction between electrons and photons. That's how photosynthesis works. If you think about plants making the oxygen that we're breathing now and making most of our food and all this, how do they get energy from the sun? Right? They're absorbing photons of light. And those photons of light are exciting the electrons. And where do the electrons come from, you know? Where do the electrons in photosynthesis come from? It's a flow of electrons. The light is being used, sunlight's being used to get these electrons flowing, to power the plants, then make energy and make sugars and all this stuff. This is really mind-blowing. We forget this. Like you probably, maybe you learned it in high school, maybe not. But the electrons are coming from water. You water your plant. The plants are sucking up water. They split the water, the H2O, into O2, which is then comes out and we can breathe it, and hydrogen ions and a pair of electrons. And your body does the exact opposite, by the way. You breathe O2, and then in your mitochondria, in your cells, that's generating your energy, the oxygen comes in as a final electron acceptor, and it's picking up the electrons and some hydrogen ions and making water. Your body makes water in the production of energy. You get energy because of an electron transport chain in your mitochondria. There's electrons flowing through your mitochondria. The food that you eat, like glucose gets broken down. Your body literally harvests electrons from glucose to power you. You are alive and breathing and doing what you're doing because of little electrons flowing through your cells. And plants do what they do because of electrons, that the energy that they get by absorbing photons. So it's just like this unbelievable, everything really comes down to electrons. In chemistry, all of chemistry is about electrons. Remember all this ionic bonding, covalent bonding, metals give electrons to nonmetals, covalent, two nonmetals share electrons. It's all we think about is electrons, really. In chemistry, it's all electrons. Everything comes down to electrons. And when you go back to creation, how did creation begin? Really, you have to make electrons. And where do the electrons come from? You have the original, whatever you want to call it, Vayehi O, if you want to call it the Big Bang or whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. We talked about this before. That scientists really uncovered what the Torah says anyways, that everything began with this burst of light. And light condensed into matter, or energy, some sort of radiance, radiation, Zohar, right? Zohar means radiance that condensed into matter, but it began with light. And then you had to have electrons, and then you had protons, and then atoms formed, and then atoms came together and fused into other elements, and so on. But everything begins on this process. It begins with the interaction of photons and electrons. It all begins with the interaction of light, photons, and electrons. And they're two sides of the same coin, photons and electrons. Electrical energy can flow theoretically near light speed. It's almost at the speed of light. So there's this really deep interplay between photons and electrons, which is really amazing. Even your brain, your thoughts, how do you think? It's all electricity. Right? Every muscle movement is electrical. Right? Your brain sends an electrical signal to make your muscles twitch. So even we are powered by Chashmal. And unbelievably, the Arizal said that. The Arizal understood this better than anybody. It's incredible what he says. You know what he says? He says that Chashmal is the secret of basar vegidim, the secret of muscles and nerves. That's what he says. He said this 500 years ago. The secret of muscles and nerves. How do muscles and nerves work? Chashmal. And he says, Amoach eino yonekhu rak me'achashmal. The brain does not work but through Chashmal. So for centuries, people didn't understand what he was saying. People tried to, later, rabbis and scholars, because he was the Arizal. He had it through divine inspiration, through Ruach HaKodesh. He had a sense of a level of prophecy. And for many years, people did not understand, did not grasp, even to this day, people did not grasp what he was saying. What does that mean, Amoach? They tried to explain all this spirit. He must have been talking about such deep spiritual realities that we can't even begin to understand them. Little did they know that the Arizal was really revealing incredible scientific secrets. He's saying the brain works Chashmal. It's electrical. And today we know that's exactly true, right? You go, if you need a brain scan, you do an electroencephalogram. We see how the brain's electrical signaling works. Your brain is electrical. Your nerves are electrical. The Arizal said that the secret of basar and gidim, of muscles and of meat, of flesh and nerves, is Chashmal. And nobody knew what he was saying. What was he talking about? In the 1700s,
Galvani, the Italian scientist, started experimenting with frogs. And he noticed that you can shock the frogs and their muscles will twitch. And scientists started to realize, hey, what's going on here? There's this biological electricity in our bodies. When I was in university, we did this. We used to kill... Exactly. You can revive a person, of course, with a defibrillator. You can shock their heart back because the heart's electrical, right? The heartbeat's electrical. It's incredible if you see how the heart works. The pacemaker of the heart, unbelievable. You can measure the voltages. We did this when I was in university. We used to take frogs and we used to put them to sleep permanently. And we did it very gently. And we would cut them open while their cells were still alive. And we would attach the sciatic nerve. They have big legs, right? The frogs have it's easy to experiment on the legs. And we would open up the legs and take the sciatic nerve and literally attach electrodes to it and start playing with it and see what happens. And it makes the legs twitch and the muscles twitch. And then we'd open the heart and we see what happens to the heart, jumpstart the heart again, the frog's heart. Poor frog. But the frog's dead. But then we jumpstart the heart. And then we see how, we start playing with the heart, with the electrical signaling. We drop different chemicals on it. What happens when you drop some adrenaline? You start seeing the heart beat faster. What happens when you drop, atropine, acetylcholine? We would experiment on these frogs, on their nerves and on their muscles and on their hearts. And that was really something that Galvani would do back in the late 1700s. And ultimately, Galvani and Volta, everybody knows Volts today, named after Alessandro Volta. They had a big kind of competition between them. Volta went on to invent the first battery and kind of transform the world. And everybody remembers Volta, but not so much Galvani. But all this stuff was happening in the 17 and 1800s, and the Arizal already said in the 1500s, what scientists only discovered a couple of hundred years later. It's unbelievable. So everything really comes down to electricity. The whole cosmos, all matter, all chemistry, all biology, it's all electrons. It is Chashmal. And our sages already said this 2,000 years ago, 2,200 years ago.
The thing is that with photons, you are creating Hasmal.
Yes. So what is the connection between the light? So we're saying that Chashmal is the Or Haganuz. It's a hidden light. It's like light, but it's something else. Now we can try to kind of understand it, right? The photons are kind of like the light and electricity, which is like this other side. It's all part of the same force. It's all part of the electromagnetic spectrum, electromagnetism, which includes radiation, light, electricity. So this divine, this hidden light is really referring to Chashmal, as the Kabbalists really say openly. And if you go back to creation, right, we have this interplay. What is the relationship between photons and electrons, between light and electricity? We talked about this a long time ago. I don't know if you remember. We mentioned it briefly. It's something called the fine structure constant. The fine structure constant tells us the relationship between these two properties. And when scientists discovered this, they had some incredible things to say about it, right? That the universe would not exist without this number. And it's a very special number. And when you plug it into the formula, it's a dimensionless number. It has no units. And it comes out to be, do you remember this number?
5.3.
It's 137, or 1 over 137. And 137 represents, 1 over 137 is the relationship between photons and electrons, which really gives life to the whole universe. The universe exists because of this constant. Richard Feynman, this great physicist, Richard Feynman said, some people say Richard Feynman, I don't know, but his parents are from Russia, he's Feynman. Richard Feynman said that any good physicist should have this number posted on their wall and think about it all the time. This number 137. It represents the relationship between photons and electrons. And in Judaism, what is the number that represents that same thing? What is the subject of study that's all about trying to understand how matter comes to be? Ma'aseh bereshit. What is the secret of creation? How does God bring about matter? How does light become matter? That's all the field of Kabbalah. That's what Kabbalah is. And what is the numerical value of Kabbalah? Kuf is 100, Bet is 2, Lamed is 30, Hey is 5. Kabbalah is 137. So the word in science that represents really the mystery of creation and the word in Judaism that represents the mystery of creation is the same. It's the same number. It's 137. It's Kabbalah. It's the fine structure constant. And scientists knew this. Sommerfeld was amazed by this, and he wasn't Jewish. He was amazed. He said, how could it be that this word Kabbalah, that this study of Kabbalah has the same value as the fine structure constant?
Wolfgang Pauli, who's another great physicist, the Pauli exclusion principle, if you remember from chemistry. He was obsessed with this number 137. Carl Jung was obsessed with this number. There's actually a book about this, about 137, and Pauli's and Carl Jung's obsession with the number 137, and this incredible correspondence between Jewish mysticism and science. What's funny is that none of these people are actually halachically Jewish. Sommerfeld wasn't Jewish, Carl Jung wasn't Jewish, although Carl Jung in one place thought that he was the reincarnation of Shimon Bar Yochai, or he felt like he was Rashbi. He writes in his last autobiography before he passed away. So this is really where kind of Torah and science meet, and this is why so many of our sages said that if you don't understand science, you will never understand the secrets of Torah. The Vilna Gaon said this: if you don't understand natural knowledge, natural forces, you will lack 100 times more in Torah. The Maharal said something very similar. Rav Yosef Kafach, in the last generation, he served on the Beit Din, on the Jerusalem Beit Din with Rav Ovadia and Rav Waldenberg, and Rav Yosef Kafach was the third one on the Beit Din. He actually held that learning science can fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah. Because really, what are you learning? You're studying God's wisdom. You're studying how God created the universe. And it's based on the Rambam. The Rambam in Ilchot Deot at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah says, how do you come to love God? Go and study His works. Go and study what God made. And so many of our greatest actually said that if you don't know science, you won't understand the secrets of Torah. And now we see why, because that's where it really all comes together. Let's kind of summarize here. We said that Ezekiel saw the Merkava, and he seems to be suggesting that it's powered by Chashmal. And then our sages really add on to that and make it clear. Even the Balaturim who lived before the Ramak and the Arizal, he knew this secret too. If you look at what he says, the Balaturim in his comment on Vayehi bin Soa Ha'aron, we say that all the time, right? Vayehi bin Soa Ha'aron. He says, what does that mean, Vayehi bin Soa Ha'aron? And the Balaturim says, Nosea Ha'aron Mesia imo Merkava v'chayot HaKodesh, that when the Ark of the Covenant would be carried, with it were moving the divine chariot, the Merkava and the Chayot HaKodesh, that what Ezekiel saw was moving with it. Okay, and what does that mean? He says, Bin Soa, the word Bin Soa, Vayi Bin Soaron, there's a method of letter manipulation called Atbach. Okay, in the method of manipulation called Atbach, it's the same. Bin Soa becomes Chashmal. When you transform the letters of Bin Soa through the process of Adbach, maybe you've heard of Adbash, right? Everybody knows Adbash. That's a simple one, where you transform Aleph to Taf, Bet to Shin, right? The first letter is switched with the last letter. It's one of the ways of encrypting, one of the ways that the Torah encodes information. So there's a few of them. There's also Albam, for example, and another one is Atbach. So when you transform Bin Soa Aaron in the Atbach system, you get the word Chashmal. What does that mean? And also, he says, Bin Soa, when you do Atbash, then the gematria that you get is actually Kechvod HaMerkava. So when you transform this word in various ways, it alludes to Chashmal and the chariot, and he's implying that even the Ark of the Covenant was powered by Chashmal. Just like the chariot, the Merkava and the Ark of the Covenant had something to do with Hasmal.
Of the ark, when they were traveling with it, the desert, they used to send beams and kill everything.
That's right. There's all kinds of interesting descriptions of the ark. How did it do those amazing things? And now think about that. Think about Ezekiel describing the Merkava as being electrical. And it sounds almost like sacrilegious to say this, but the reality is, think of a modern airplane. We use electricity also to build flying machines. Is that so different? It sounds crazy. It sounds like, well, that can't be, right? It's almost like we want to say that Chashmal must be spiritual. This can't be right. We're so used to thinking of these things as being spiritual. But again, the Arizal is telling you this is very much, and the Ramak, this is very much a chomer. This is a real substance that the angels use. And the implication is clear. The Arizal is telling you the same Chashmal powers your muscles and your nerves and your brain. And we know what that is today. There's no doubt about it. This is not like something even debatable. This is clear. It's very much electrical. Right? It's 100% electricity. And when you look at those people that we were talking about earlier, Galvani, Volta, these early electrical scientists, Humphrey Davy, Nikola Tesla, who was actually of a later generation, if you look at the way they described what they were doing, they felt like they were harvesting divine power. they felt like electricity has always been associated with the divine, right? With something beyond this earth, like lightning as being this godly power, even in non-Jew, like even in ancient mythologies, even in Greek mythology. Lightning always has this mystical, divine quality to it. And so when the early electrical scientists were able to harness electricity, they felt like they were harnessing the divine power. And they were right, because think of how this electricity has transformed the world. We live magical lives today because of electricity, and we're just so used to it that we take it for granted. Like, you can just take your phone and like FaceTime somebody halfway around the world. That's incredible. Like, if you showed that to somebody 100 years ago, they would have thought that was witchcraft. Like, this is absolute magic. Right? Arthur C. Clarke famously said that any advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Like, it's really mad. Do we really understand how the computer works, how the phone works, how satellites work, whatever it is, all these things, airplanes, like, this is absolutely, we've been able to transform the world and do incredible. How do you think of just even an airplane, right? The magic of taking something that's hundreds of tons and making it float through the air, right? And allowing you to just traverse the planet so quickly. It's very much magical, and what's allowed us to do that is electricity, and we just got so used to it that we take it for granted. But this is really a divine power.
So why can't you use electricity on Shabbat?
Because it's a divine power, and you're supposed to rest from divine power on Shabbat. And all of this, really, I want to end with this, that all of this comes back to a prophecy, famous prophecy in the Zohar. The Zohar says on Parashat Noach, "Uveshit mea shanin leshtita'a." It's a very famous prophecy of the Zohar. It's based on Parashat Noach. It says that in the sixth century, leshtita'a, of the sixth millennium, what's going to happen? The 6th century of the 6th millennium. Itpatchun tar'ei de chokhmata, that the gates of wisdom will be opened. The gates of wisdom, the chokhmata le'ela, of the divine upper wisdom, umevuye de chokhmata letata, and also the springs of lower wisdom. Ve'itakan alma, and the world will be rectified le'ala b'shvia, to be prepared for the 7th millennium, to the messianic age, to the future world. Just like kebarnash, and we spoke about this before, just like a person, kebarnash de mitaken beyom hashtita, just like a person prepares on Friday for Shabbat, right? And the siman, the Zohar says, is what it says in Parashat Noach, bishnat 600 shana lechayei Noach, that in the 600th year of Noach's life, the Torah says, nifkeu kol ma'ayonot tehom rabba. Remember that that's in the 600th year the flood started, and the gates of heaven opened to bring rain, and the fountains of the deep opened to bring forth water. So the Zohar says, what is that really secretly alluding to? That similarly, in the 6th century of the 6th millennium, the gates of wisdom from above and below will open up and flood the world to prepare the world for the messianic age. What does it mean? What does it mean, the wisdom from above? Wisdom from above means spiritual wisdom, Torah wisdom. Wisdom from below, scientific wisdom, right? Earthly wisdom. And there will be this huge leap forward from the 6th century of the 6th millennium in the knowledge, spiritually and physically, that will just completely revolutionize the world. And that's precisely what's happened. Because in the Jewish world, of course, from that time, if you count the 6th, that means that it begins from the year 5500, really, right? The 6th millennium, the 6th century of the 6th millennium, starting in the year 5500, and the current year is 5783. So go back 283 years, right in the mid-1700s. That's when you start seeing this explosion of Jewish texts, of Kabbalah, of Hasidut, all this spiritual knowledge flooding the world, and at the same time, also earthly, this great leap forward in science. And in fact, when it comes to electricity, this is something that's really incredible, because the Jewish year 5500 is really 1740. You know what happened in 1740? What is the first electrical device? Yes. So we consider kind of like the Industrial Revolution of starting at that time. But the first really, truly electrical device, close, you almost said it, it was called the Leyden jar. The Leyden jar, it's a very little known thing, but the Leyden jar was the first thing that really allowed us to store electricity and then to kind of use it. It was kind of like the precursor to the battery, and it was invented in 1745. So the whole electrical age, really, some people say, pinpointed as with the invention of the Leyden jar. And then around 1800, Volta created the first real battery. And then, of course, the rest is history. And then the things that Tesla did. And Tesla is an interesting figure because he believed that really electricity can solve all the world's problems. And he said all the secrets of the universe can be really grasped with electricity. And of course, Tesla had all these incredible patents, and as the famous conspiracy goes, when he passed away, the US government took a whole bunch of them, and they've never seen the light of day. And if you remember, Tesla tried to build Wardenclyffe Tower to basically provide the whole world with free electricity wirelessly, but that wouldn't be in the interests of big business. So, you got to charge people for electricity, so that didn't go well. But Tesla kind of had a sad ending to his life, very alone and bankrupt, but he totally transformed the world. Right? Tesla built the first AC power plant, and like all the power plants, pretty much all the world's power plants today follow the AC model. So Tesla really single-handedly transformed the world. But people like Tesla, if you look at what he said, Tesla said that if you want to really understand the universe, you got to think in terms of these kinds of properties of energies, frequencies, right? Electrical kind of properties. So that's how you understand the secrets of the universe. Now, the Zohar says Shit Mea Shanin, which really means in the year 600, but it can also be read as Shit Mea, as in the 6th century, because really it's not going to happen overnight. It's a transition period, and even Noach, he had 120 years to prepare for the flood. So the flood started in the 600th year, but there is all this preparatory time before. And so what the Zohar is really saying is that throughout the 6th century, so over those 100 years, the world will transition into that final era before the Messianic age. And that's exactly what we see, that from 5500 to 5600, that's really what even historians pinpoint as the start of the Industrial Revolution, those years of 1740 to 1840. And so the process began in 1740 with some of the first electrical devices and starting to understand what this phenomenon is. And then in 1840, it really took off. And a few years after that, shortly after that, the first telegram was laid between Europe and America, and that was kind of like the internet of its day, and it made the world so much smaller. And then we had this great age of electrical invention with Edison and Tesla and the light bulb and the gramophone and this telephone and the AC power plant, and then the whole world was very quickly transformed. Just like it says, the prophet Isaiah says, Be'ita achishena, that when the time comes, God says, when the time comes to bring about the Messianic age, I will accelerate things very quickly. Be'ita achishena, at the time, I will speed things up. And so the world has very rapidly changed since then. So all of that came true. All of that has come true, and the Zohar's prophecy has really come true right before our eyes. And now we really understand what Chashmal is. And we take it for granted, but really this is an incredible divine power, and we shouldn't take it for granted. We should realize what it is and appreciate it, how it's transformed our lives. And really we've only scratched the surface, because if we're saying that the angels use it to really traverse the cosmos and to go between dimensions and to do all kinds of things, they are far more advanced in using this power than we are, and we're just really scratching the surface, and the best is yet to come. If you remember the last Mishnah in Masechet Uktzin, says that every righteous person in the world to come has 310 worlds as a gift. Shai Olamot, right? You have 310 worlds as a gift, and we think about that, like, again, what does that mean? We always think about that, well, it must be spiritual worlds, right? But why? Right? It could very well be. The universe is so big. We have billions of stars and planets. We have a lot more to uncover. Yeah, the universe has all these billions of stars and planets, and God says clearly in the Talmud that God says, I made it all for you. All right, there will be a time when we will explore all these worlds, and perhaps Chashmal is really the secret behind how we're going to get there once we really understand how to really use this divine power. And to just tie it back to Hanukkah, Hanukkah is Chet Semel. It's the 8 days of Hanukkah are these 8 energies that are composed of these 378 divine lights, which is really the power of the Chashmal. It's Chet Semel. And Hanukkah is this divine light, which is really representing this power, this great power behind Chashmal, electricity, which our sages translated as electron, really the power of the electron. And even when you light that fire, fire is also ultimately a reaction that involves electrons, right? Oxygen's coming in and picking up electrons from your fuel source. And again, it just comes down to electrical phenomena, electronic phenomena. And so that's like really at the heart of all of creation. That's the divine light of creation. So we'll end there. Chag Sameach. May you have an enlightening Hanukkah.